The Wraith of Veyrune. Chapter 1, The Scream That Woke the Shadows. The town of Veyrune lay cradled in a valley encircled by jagged mountains, their peaks swallowed by a restless fog that clung to the earth like a living curse. Cobblestone streets twisted through rows of sagging rooftops, where gas lamps flickered feebly, their light barely piercing the oppressive mist that seemed to breathe with malevolent intent. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone, mildew, and something older, a metallic tang that lingered like the memory of blood spilled long ago. At night, Veyrune's residents bolted their doors, not for fear of thieves, but of shadows that moved when no one was looking, their shapes dissolving into the fog when stared at too long. It was just past midnight when a scream tore through the silence, a raw, guttural cry that seemed to wound the night itself, echoing from the heart of the town square. The statue of Saint Aldrich loomed there, its weathered stone face carved into a grimace that seemed to mourn the town's secrets, its outstretched hand holding a broken sword. By the time the constables arrived, their boots clattering on wet cobblestones, a crowd had gathered, their breaths forming fleeting clouds in the chill air. Whispers rippled through the onlookers, stifled by the sight at the statue's base, where the fog parted like a curtain to reveal a horror that turned even the hardiest stomachs. A young woman's body, or half of it. From her shoulders to her waist, she lay pristine, her hands folded delicately over her chest as if arranged for a funeral, her dark hair fanned out like a halo on the cold stone. Below the waist, there was nothing. No blood, no torn flesh, just an impossibly clean severance that defied reason. Her eyes were wide, frozen in a rictus of terror, and her mouth gaped, as if her final scream still lingered in the air, trapped in the mist. Tucked into her folded hands was a scrap of black lace, embroidered with a silver crescent moon that gleamed faintly in the gaslight, its edges frayed as if torn from something ancient. Inspector Elias Varn knelt beside the corpse, his trench coat damp with mist, his breath forming faint plumes in the cold. His gray eyes, sharp as a blade's edge, scanned the scene with a quiet intensity that belied the storm raging in his mind. This was the 9th victim in 7 months, each one halved, bloodless, and left in public view like a grotesque offering to an unseen deity. The town was unraveling, its people gripped by a fear that seeped into their bones, and Elias felt its weight pressing against his chest, threatening to crack the carefully guarded composure he'd built over years of grim work. No footprints, he murmured, tracing the cobblestones with a gloved finger, his voice low and steady despite the tremor in his hands. No drag marks. No arterial spray. Nothing. A figure pushed through the crowd, her auburn hair catching the gaslight like a dying ember, her presence cutting through the murmurs like a knife. Clara Veyrier, Veyrune's only journalist, clutched a leather-bound notebook, her pen scratching furiously against the page, her green eyes glinting with a mix of determination and defiance. She was a thorn in Elias's side, a relentless seeker of truth whose articles stirred whispers the town preferred to silence, her words fanning the flames of fear and curiosity in equal measure. "Inspector Varn," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling hands of the onlookers, her gaze locked on the body. "This is no animal attack. 9 bodies, all the same, halved, bloodless, marked with that crescent moon. You can't keep calling it a coincidence." Elias rose, his face a mask of irritation, though a flicker of unease danced in his eyes. "Miss Veyrier, this is a crime scene, not your next headline. Step back." Clara ignored him, kneeling beside the body, her fingers hesitating before touching the lace, her breath catching as she studied the corpse's frozen expression. No blood splatter. No signs of struggle. It's as if she was placed here, like an offering to something. You've seen this before, haven't you? You're seeing patterns where there are none, Elias snapped, his voice sharper than he intended, betraying a flicker of doubt that he quickly buried. Clara held up the lace, the crescent moon glinting faintly, its silver threads catching the light like a spider's web. This was on the others, wasn't it? Every single one. What are you hiding, Elias? Elias snatched it from her, his jaw tightening, his fingers crushing the delicate delicate fabric. You're meddling in things you don't understand, Clara. Go home. She met his gaze, unflinching, her voice low but firm, a challenge in her eyes. Someone has to ask questions, Elias. Someone has to tell the truth. And it's not going to be you. As she spoke, the mist thickened, curling around the statue like a serpent, its tendrils weaving through the crowd, cold and heavy as a shroud. For a fleeting moment, Elias thought he saw a shadow move within it, tall, impossibly thin, its edges dissolving into the fog like ink in water. He blinked, and it was gone, but the chill in his bones lingered, a silent warning that something was watching, waiting, its presence as real as the corpse at his feet. Chapter 2, The Ghosts of 1861. Elias sat in his cramped study, the air heavy with the acrid bite of tobacco and the musty scent of old books, their spines cracked and faded like the town's forgotten promises. A single candle burned on his desk, its flame trembling as if afraid of the dark, casting long shadows that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking. He unlocked a drawer and pulled out a battered file, its edges frayed from years of handling, its pages yellowed and curling like dead leaves. Inside were reports, sketches, and photographs, each a fragment of a nightmare that refused to stay buried, a record of horrors that had haunted Veyrune since 1861. The earliest case dated to that year, a time when gas lamps were new and the town's faith in progress was unshaken. 9 bodies, halved and bloodless, had been found in Veyrier squares, alleys, and riverbanks, each marked with a crescent moon. The killings had stopped abruptly, and the town had buried the truth beneath layers of silence, as if silence could erase the stain of blood. But now, the past was clawing its way back, and Elias felt its weight in every sleepless night, every shadow that flickered at the edge of his vision, every dream that left him gasping for air. He opened a photograph, its edges brittle with age, the sepia tones faded but sharp enough to cut, a group of girls from Veyrier old seminary, their faces stiff with forced smiles, their eyes haunted by something unspoken, as if they knew what was coming. One face was circled in red ink, a girl with pale skin and eyes that seemed to pierce the lens, as if she could see him across the decades, her gaze a silent accusation. Her name was Isolde Renard. She had vanished after a fire razed the seminary in 1861, leaving behind whispers of forbidden rituals, occult books, and a darkness that had seeped into the town's bones, never truly gone. "Is it you?" Elias whispered, tracing her face with a trembling finger, his voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. "Are you still here?" A knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts, the sound sharp and intrusive, like a blade through the quiet. It was Father Anselm, Veyrun's aging priest, his hands clutching a rosary as if it were a lifeline, his eyes bloodshot and sunken, his face etched with lines that spoke of sleepless nights and unspoken fears. "You're digging into the seminary cases, aren't you?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper, his breath visible in the cold air of the study. Elias nodded, his throat tight, his fingers still lingering on the photograph. "What do you know, Father?" Anselm's gaze darted to the shadows, as if expecting something to emerge from the corners of the room. Isolde was different. "She came to me once, as a boy, barely 16, raving about mirrors that showed her things, faces that weren't hers, places that burned her mind, landscapes of ash and bone. She said the crescent moon was a key to the veil, a way to open a door that should stay shut. The veil? Elias asked, leaning forward, his voice sharp with urgency, his heart pounding in his chest. The boundary between our world and something else, Anselm said, his voice trembling, his hands twisting the rosary until the beads left red marks on his skin. She believed something was waiting to cross, something ancient, hungry, and cruel. She called it the Wraith beyond the veil, a name that carried a weight I didn't understand then. Elias's fingers tightened around the photograph, the paper crinkling under his grip. And the killings? Anselm's eyes glistened with tears, his voice breaking. They started after she vanished. A girl was found dead, her eyes replaced with shards of glass, her mouth sewn shut with black thread. The church sealed the seminary, burned the books, buried the mirrors in consecrated ground. But the darkness, it never left. It's still here, Elias, in the fog, in the shadows, in the silence. Chapter 3, The Seminary's Silent Curse. Clara stood before the abandoned seminary, its Gothic spires piercing the gray sky like skeletal fingers clawing at the heavens, their tips lost in the swirling fog. The building was a husk, its windows boarded with splintered wood, its red brick walls blackened by fire and time, as if the flames had left not just scars but a curse that pulsed in the air. She had spent 3 nights in the town archives, poring over brittle records, faded photographs, and newspaper clippings yellowed with age, her eyes burning from lack of sleep. All 9 victims had ties to the seminary, students, teachers, or their descendants, their lives spanning decades but bound by an invisible thread that reeked of blood and ritual. The connection was undeniable, but the why remained a shadow just beyond her grasp, a puzzle that whispered her name in the dark. She slipped through a rusted gate, its hinges screaming in protest, her boots crunching on frost-covered gravel, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. The air inside was stale, thick with mildew and a faint metallic tang that set her nerves on edge, like the aftertaste of blood on her tongue. The main hall was a graveyard of splintered pews, scattered papers, and broken candelabras, their wax drippings frozen like tears on the warped floorboards. Dust danced in shafts of pale light filtering through cracked boards, and the air seemed to hum with a low, almost imperceptible vibration, as if the building itself were breathing. A portrait above the grand staircase stopped her cold, its presence a weight that pressed against her chest. It depicted a woman in a high-collared black dress, her face stern, her eyes like chips of ice that seemed to follow Clara's every move, their gaze boring into her soul with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The plaque read, Madame Lisette Corvas, Headmistress, 1845 to 1861. Clara felt a chill, as if the portrait were not just watching but judging her, its eyes whispering secrets she wasn't ready to hear. A voice rasped from the shadows, sharp and brittle, like the crack of dry bones underfoot. You're trespassing, girl. Clara spun, her heart leaping into her throat, to see an old woman, hunched and cloaked in tattered black, her silhouette blending with the darkness like a ghost half-formed. Her face was a web of wrinkles, but her eyes burned with unsettling clarity, as if they saw through flesh to bone, through time to truth, their gaze cutting deeper than any knife. Madame Corvas? Clara asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, her notebook clutched like a shield. The woman's lips curled into a sneer, revealing teeth yellowed with age, her breath sour and cold, like air from a crypt. You're a fool, chasing ghosts in a place like this. Leave before it claims you. I need answers, Clara said, her knuckles white around her notebook, her voice rising with defiance. About Isolde Renard. About the crescent moon. About the bodies. Corvus stepped closer, her presence a weight that made the air heavier, her eyes gleaming with something like reverence, or fear. Isolde saw what others couldn't. She looked into the dark and called to it, "Girl." And it answered. It always answers. What answered? Clara pressed, her voice sharp, her heart pounding as the hum in the air grew louder, a vibration that crawled up her spine. "The Wraith," Corvus whispered, her voice dropping to a hiss, her eyes glinting like polished obsidian. "It lives where mirrors break and shadows bleed. It's hungry, girl. It's been hungry for centuries, and it never forgets a debt." Clara's heart pounded, but she held her ground, her pen trembling in her hand, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "What does it want?" Corvus's smile was cruel, her voice a blade in the dark. "Everything. Your blood. Your soul. Your name. It wants to wear your flesh, to walk where you walk, to breathe where you breathe. And it will have it, unless you burn it out." Chapter 4, The Mark of the Damned. Elias sat in the coroner's office, the air thick with the stench of formaldehyde and despair, the walls stained with years of grim truths. Dr. Paget, a wiry man with nervous hands and eyes that darted like a trapped animal's, pointed to the latest victim's tongue, lifting the flesh with a gloved hand that trembled slightly. "A scar," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "A crescent moon, burned into the tissue. All 9 victims have it." Elias's stomach churned, a cold dread settling in his gut like a stone, heavy and unyielding. "Ritualistic?" he asked, his voice steady but his hands clenching into fists. Paget nodded, his face pale, his voice barely audible. "It's not natural. It's deliberate, like a brand. I've never seen anything like it, Elias. It's as if something marked them for death, something that wanted them to know they were chosen." Elias left, his mind racing, fragments of Anselm's words echoing in his head like a litany of doom. He headed to the cathedral, its spire looming through the fog like a sentinel of forgotten sins, its stone walls cold and unyielding. Inside, Father Anselm was polishing candelabras, his hands trembling, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights haunted by memories he couldn't confess. The priest's face crumpled as Elias recounted the coroner's findings, his voice breaking as he spoke. "Isolde came to me once," Anselm said, his voice low, as if afraid the walls might hear, his hands clutching the rosary so tightly the beads left red marks on his skin. "I was a boy, barely 16, assisting the old priest. She was terrified, raving about mirrors that showed her things, people with no faces, places that shouldn't exist, burning landscapes filled with screams and ash. She said the crescent moon was a key to open the veil, a door to something she couldn't name." "The veil?" Elias asked, his voice sharp with urgency, leaning closer, his heart pounding in his chest. Anselm's eyes darted to the stained glass windows, their colors muted by the fog outside, as if the light itself were afraid to shine. "The boundary between our world and something else. She believed something was waiting to cross, something that fed on blood and fear, something that whispered her name in the dark. She called it the Wraith." Elias's blood ran cold, his fingers tightening around the photograph in his pocket, its edges cutting into his palm. "Did she mention the killings?" Anselm nodded, his voice barely audible, his hands trembling as if the memory alone could summon the darkness. "They started after she vanished. A girl was found dead, her eyes replaced with shards of glass, her mouth sewn shut with black thread, her body halved like an offering. The church sealed the seminary, burned the books, buried the mirrors in consecrated ground. But the darkness, it never left. It's in the fog, Elias, in the shadows, in the silence that chokes this town. Chapter 5, The Dream of Ashes and Bone. Elias woke gasping, his sheets soaked with sweat, his heart pounding like a war drum in a battle he couldn't see. In his dream, he stood in a seminary courtyard, surrounded by faceless children who laughed and screamed in unison, their voices blending into a cacophony that clawed at his mind, tearing at the edges of his sanity. A woman in black lace beckoned from a doorway, her face hidden behind a veil that shimmered like liquid shadow, her presence a weight that pressed against his chest. As he approached, the children dissolved into ash, their screams echoing in his skull, their bodies crumbling into piles of bone and dust. From the ashes rose Isolde, her eyes hollow, her mouth stretched into a smile that wasn't hers, her lips moving without sound, forming words he couldn't hear but felt in his bones. "You left me," she said, her voice a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from inside his skull, each word a needle piercing his mind. "But I found my way back." He stumbled to his bathroom, the floor cold against his bare feet, and splashed water on his face, the shock of it doing little to dispel the dream's grip. His reflection in the mirror wasn't alone. A figure stood behind him, tall, impossibly thin, its face a blur of shadow and glass, its eyes two burning voids that seemed to pull at his soul. It raised a hand, and the mirror cracked, a single jagged line splitting his reflection in two, as if cleaving his very being. Elias grabbed his coat and headed for the seminary, his heart pounding, the photograph of Isolde burning a hole in his pocket, its edges sharp against his fingers. He found Clara in the basement, standing before a stone altar stained with dark, crusted patches that reeked of old blood, the air thick with the stench of decay and something sharper, rust or perhaps something alive. Her eyes were fixed on a trembling mirror framed in black iron, its surface clouded but pulsing with a sickly, greenish light that seemed to breathe, its rhythm syncing with their heartbeats. "Clara," he shouted, his voice echoing in the chamber, bouncing off the walls like a trapped animal, raw with desperation. "Get away from it." She turned, her face pale as death, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and fascination, her hands trembling as she clutched her notebook. "It's her, Elias. Isolde. She's in there. I saw her, her face, her eyes, bleeding black." The mirror pulsed, and a sound like breaking bones filled the room, a grinding, snapping cacophony that set their teeth on edge and made their skin crawl. A hand emerged, skeletal, with fingers like shards of glass, each one glinting with an unnatural light that burned the eyes. It reached for Clara, who froze, her breath visible in the sudden cold that enveloped the chamber, the air heavy with the weight of something ancient and hungry. Elias lunged, pulling her back, his hands shaking, his voice raw. "We need to destroy it." Clara shook her head, her voice trembling, her eyes still locked on the mirror, as if drawn to it by a force she couldn't resist. "It's not just the mirror. It's her. She's using the victims to finish something she started all those years ago." Words appeared on the mirror, scratched as if by a claw, glowing faintly in the dark. 9 keys turned. 1 remains. Chapter 6, The Coven's Unholy Oath. Clara and Elias sat in her apartment, the air thick with the scent of coffee gone cold and the faint mustiness of old paper, the room lit by a single lamp that flickered like a dying star. Isolde's journal lay open between them, its pages a labyrinth of cryptic symbols, chants, and names, written in a hand that trembled with fervor and fear, its ink faded but still potent, like a curse that refused to die. The journal detailed a coven of 10 girls, led by Isolde, who had sought to summon the Wraith beyond the veil, a being that promised forbidden knowledge, secrets of life, death, and the spaces between, but demanded blood in return, a price paid in souls and suffering. The ritual required 10 sacrifices, 10 keys marked with the crescent moon. 9 had been offered before the seminary burned in 1861, and Isolde vanished, her fate a mystery that haunted Veyrune's history like a ghost that refused to rest. They never finished, Clara said, her voice hollow, her fingers tracing the jagged script, her eyes haunted by the weight of what she'd read. But now she's back, killing to complete the ritual. The victims, they're the descendants of the coven, or the coven members themselves, their blood tied to the pact. Elias pointed to a list of names in the journal, his face grim, his fingers steady despite the storm in his mind. The victims matched, 9 girls or their kin, their lives snuffed out in a pattern that mirrored the past, each death a step closer to an unseen goal. One name is missing. The 10th key. Clara opened her locket, her hands trembling as she revealed a faded photograph of a woman who looked strikingly like her features softened by time but unmistakable, her eyes carrying the same weight Clara felt in her own. On the back was a name, written in a delicate hand, Margot Arnault. "My mother," Clara whispered, her voice breaking, her hands shaking so violently the locket nearly slipped from her grasp. "I was adopted. My real name is Clara Arnault." Elias's face darkened, his eyes narrowing as the pieces fell into place, a puzzle he wished he could unsee. "You're the 10th key." Clara's breath caught, her eyes widening as the revelation settled over her like a shroud, heavy and suffocating. "That's why I've been dreaming of her. Isolde. She's been calling me, pulling me toward the mirrors, whispering my name in the dark." Elias leaned forward, his voice urgent, his eyes searching hers. "What did you see in your dreams, Clara? Tell me everything." Clara's hands shook as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes distant, as if seeing the images again. A courtyard filled with burning children, their faces gone, their screams silent but deafening. A woman in black lace, her face hidden, standing in a doorway that led to nowhere. And Isolde, standing in the flames, smiling, her eyes bleeding black, her hands reaching for me. She said my name, Elias. She said I was hers, that I was the final piece. Chapter 7, The Whisper in the Mirror's Heart. Clara couldn't sleep, her mind a storm of fear and questions, her body trembling with a cold that came from within. She stood before her bedroom mirror, the journal clutched in her hands, its weight a reminder of the truth she couldn't escape, its pages a map to a destiny she didn't want. Slowly, she opened her mouth and stared at her reflection, her heart pounding, her breath shallow. On her tongue was a scar, a crescent moon, faint but unmistakable, its edges raw as if freshly burned, a mark that pulsed with a life of its own. She stumbled back, her breath ragged, the journal falling to the floor with a thud that echoed like a gunshot in the silence. The scar was a sign of the chosen, a brand that bound the bearer to the Wraith, according to Isolde's writings, its presence a chain that linked her to a ritual begun decades ago. She wasn't just investigating the story, she was its end, the final key in a lock she didn't understand. A knock at the door made her jump, her heart leaping into her throat, her hands clutching the locket like a talisman. It was Madame Corvus, her eyes glinting in the dim light of the hallway, her presence like a shadow cast by a dying fire, her silhouette sharp and menacing. "You feel it, don't you, the old woman said, her voice like dry leaves skittering across stone, her words carrying a weight that made Clara's skin crawl. The pull. The Wraith knows you, girl. It's always known you, since before you were born. Clara clutched the journal tighter, her knuckles white, her voice trembling but defiant. How do I stop it? Tell me, Corvus. Corvus's smile was cruel, her eyes gleaming with a mix of pity and malice, her breath cold as a grave. You don't. The pact was made long ago, before your mother drew breath, before your name was written in blood. Your soul was promised, your blood marked. You can only run, or surrender. Clara slammed the door, her hands shaking, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps, her vision blurring with tears she refused to shed. She sank to the floor, the journal falling open to a page with a single line, written in blood-red ink, the 10th key opens the gate. Chapter 8, The Priest's Hidden Sin. Elias returned to the cathedral, its spire looming through the fog like a needle piercing the sky, its stone walls cold and unyielding, as if guarding secrets too heavy to bear. Inside, Father Anselm was praying before a cracked stained-glass window depicting Saint Aldrich slaying a serpent, its colors dulled by the mist outside, its light flickering like a dying hope. The priest's hands trembled as Elias recounted Clara's discovery, his face crumpling as if the weight of the truth were too much, his eyes haunted by memories he tried to bury. She's in danger, Elias said, his voice sharp, his eyes boring into Anselm's, searching for answers in the old man's fear. Clara's the 10th key. You knew, didn't you? You've known all along. Anselm's face crumpled, tears streaming down his cheeks, his voice breaking as he spoke. I suspected, he whispered, his hands clutching the rosary so tightly the beads drew blood. The Wraith is no mere spirit. It's older than Veyrune, older than the church itself, older than the mountains that cradle this cursed valley. It feeds on blood and fear, and it never forgets a promise. What does it want? Elias asked, his voice low but urgent, his hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms. To cross, Anselm said, his eyes haunted, his voice barely audible, as if speaking the truth might summon the darkness. To walk our world, to wear flesh and breathe air, to claim what was promised. The coven opened a door, and Isolde was its gatekeeper. Now she's finishing what they started, and Clara is the final key. Elias gripped the priest's arm, his fingers digging into the old man's frail flesh, his voice raw with desperation. How do we close it? Tell me, Anselm. There has to be a way. Anselm's voice was a whisper, his eyes darting to the shadows, as if expecting the Wraith to emerge. With blood. Or with faith. But faith alone may not be enough. The Wraith is cunning, it twists the mind, feeds on doubt, turns hope into despair. You must be certain, or it will claim you both. Chapter 9, The Altar's Unholy Call. Clara returned to the seminary, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't resist, as if the building itself were pulling her into its blackened heart, its walls whispering her name. The basement chamber was colder now, the air thick with the stench of decay and something sharper, blood, rust, or both, a scent that clung to her skin like a second shadow. The mirrors lining the walls glowed with a sickly, greenish light, their surfaces clouded but pulsing with a life that wasn't their own, and the stone altar pulsed like a beating heart, its surface stained with dark, crusted patches that seemed to writhe in the flickering candlelight. She drew the crescent symbol on the floor, her hands trembling, her fingers smudged with chalk and fear, and lit candles from Isolde's journal, their flames casting eerie shadows that danced like specters, their movements unnatural and wrong. The mirrors began to scream, a sound like glass grinding against bone, a cacophony that set her teeth on edge and made her skin crawl, each note a blade in her mind. Clara chanted the ritual's words, her voice shaking but resolute, each syllable burning in her throat like a curse, the air growing heavy with a presence that pressed against her chest. The temperature plummeted, the air so cold her breath formed clouds, and the mirrors cracked, one by one, their surfaces splintering like ice under a hammer, their shards glinting with a light that burned the eyes. A figure emerged from the largest mirror, Isolde, or what had once been Isolde. Her body was twisted, her limbs too long, her face a mosaic of shattered glass, each shard reflecting a different nightmare, burning children, faceless figures, blood pooling on stone, faces twisted in agony. Her eyes burned with a hunger that wasn't human, a void that threatened to swallow Clara whole, its pull relentless and cruel. "You cannot stop what was promised," Isolde hissed, her voice a chorus of whispers that echoed in Clara's skull, each word a needle piercing her mind, a wound that bled doubt and fear. Clara held a candle, its flame trembling in her shaking hand, its light weak against the darkness. "You're not taking me," she said, her voice defiant despite the fear clawing at her chest, her words a shield against the void. Isolde lunged, her claws slicing through the air, their edges glinting like razors, their movements swift and unnatural. Clara threw a handful of salt, a ward from the journal, and the figure recoiled, its form flickering like a broken projection, its scream shaking the walls, a sound that threatened to unravel her sanity. Elias burst into the chamber, a silver dagger in hand, its blade blessed by Anselm and inscribed with runes that glowed faintly in the dark, their light a faint hope against the encroaching shadow. "Clara, stop," he shouted, his voice raw with desperation, his eyes wild with fear. But the mirrors shattered, their shards raining down like jagged tears, and a wind howled through the chamber, pulling Isolde back toward the largest mirror, its surface rippling like water disturbed by an unseen hand. Her eyes pleaded, her voice a whisper that cut through the chaos. "You'll never be free." Chapter 10, The Town's Shattered Silence. The next morning, Veyrune was eerily quiet, as if the town itself were holding its breath, its streets empty save for the mist that curled through them like a living thing. Shopkeepers swept their stoops, their eyes avoiding the square where St. Aldrich's statue stood, its stone face now cracked, as if weeping for the town's sins. Children no longer played near it, their laughter replaced by a heavy silence that clung to the air like damp cloth, their games abandoned in favor of whispered fears. The mist seemed thicker, its tendrils curling through the streets like fingers searching for something to claim, its presence a constant reminder of the darkness that lingered. Clara sat in a cafe, her hands trembling around a cup of cold tea, her eyes hollow from a night without sleep, her mind haunted by Isolde's words and the crescent scar on her tongue, which burned like a brand. Elias joined her, his face haggard, his arm bandaged from the night's chaos, his gray eyes clouded with exhaustion and a fear he couldn't name. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their discoveries pressing down on them like a physical force, the air thick with unspoken questions. "We need to find the other mirrors," Elias said, his voice low, his hands clenched on the table, his knuckles white. The journal mentioned a network, a web of glass connecting the town. "They're anchors for the Wraith, keeping the door open, keeping it bound to Veyrune." Clara nodded, her voice barely audible, her fingers tracing the crescent symbol in her notebook, its shape a constant reminder of her fate. The church. The mayor's house. The old mill. The apothecary's shop. The clock tower. The orphanage. They all had ties to the seminary, either through the coven or their descendants, their histories stained with blood. They split up, Elias heading to the church, Clara to the mayor's mansion, their steps heavy with purpose and dread. The town felt alive with menace, the mist whispering their names in a language that wasn't human, its syllables twisting like smoke, its presence a constant threat that lingered at the edges of their vision. Chapter 11, The Mayor's Hidden Sin. Clara slipped into the mayor's mansion, a sprawling estate on the edge of Veyrune, its windows dark and its gardens overgrown with thorny vines that seemed to reach for her as she passed. The mayor, Julian Duval, was away, attending a council meeting to quell the town's growing panic, his absence a fleeting opportunity. His study was unlocked, its door creaking open with a sound like a sigh, revealing a room lined with books and secrets. Clara found a hidden compartment in his desk, revealed by a loose panel that gave way under her touch, her fingers trembling as she opened it. Within was a mirror framed in black iron, its surface etched with the crescent moon, its edges sharp enough to cut through reality itself, its presence a weight that pressed against her chest. As she touched it, the room grew cold, the air thick with the scent of blood and something sweeter, like rotting flowers, a cloying smell that made her stomach churn. Her reflection twisted, showing her with black eyes and blood trailing from her mouth, her face aging decades in seconds, her features hollowing until she barely recognized herself. A voice whispered from the glass, soft and insidious, its words a poison in her mind, "You're mine." Clara's heart pounded, but she raised a candlestick, its weight heavy in her hand, and smashed the mirror, its shards scattering across the floor like broken teeth, their edges glinting in the dim light. The pieces writhed, reforming into the crescent symbol, glowing faintly in the dark, a sign that the Wraith's grip was not so easily broken. She fled, the journal clutched to her chest, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps, her vision blurring with fear and tears. Chapter 12, The Church's Buried Truth. Elias found Father Anselm in the cathedral's crypt, surrounded by ancient relics and flickering candles that cast long, trembling shadows, their light weak against the darkness. A mirror hung on the wall, its frame carved with symbols that matched Isolde's journal, crescents, spirals, and runes that seemed to pulse with a life of their own, their presence a silent threat. The air was heavy with the scent of incense and decay, the walls stained with the weight of centuries of secrets. It was here, Anselm admitted, his voice breaking, his hands trembling as he clutched his rosary, the beads leaving red marks on his skin. The coven used this place for their rituals, long before the seminary burned. I was a young priest then, barely more than a boy. I tried to stop them, but Isolde, she was beyond saving. Her eyes, they weren't human anymore, not after she looked into the mirrors. Elias gripped the dagger, its blade glinting in the candlelight, its runes glowing faintly, a faint hope against the encroaching shadow. "We destroy it," he said, his voice steady but his hands trembling. As he raised the blade, the mirror pulsed, and Isolde's face appeared, her features distorted, her eyes bleeding black, her mouth stretched into a smile that wasn't hers. "You can't stop the tide," she said, her voice a chorus of whispers that echoed in the crypt, a sound that threatened to unravel his mind. "The Wraith is coming." The mirror shattered, and the crypt shook, dust raining from the ceiling, the walls groaning as if in pain, the air thick with the stench of burning blood. Anselm fell to his knees, weeping, his prayers drowned out by the sound of cracking stone, his faith a fragile thing against the darkness. Chapter 13, The Mill's Haunted Echoes. Clara and Elias met at the old mill, its wheel creaking in the mist like a dying breath, its wooden frame sagging under the weight of time, its presence a reminder of Veyrune's decay. Inside, they found another mirror, hidden behind a pile of rotting grain sacks, its surface reflecting not their faces but a burning landscape filled with faceless figures, their mouths open in silent screams, their forms twisting in agony. The air was thick with the scent of mold and something sharper, like blood left to dry. Clara traced the crescent symbol etched into the frame, her fingers trembling, her breath shallow. "They're all connected," she said, her voice barely audible, her eyes fixed on the mirror's unnatural light. "Destroying one isn't enough. The Wraith is using them like a web, anchoring itself to our world, keeping the door open." Elias nodded, his face grim, his hand tightening around the dagger, its blade a faint hope in the dark. "We need to find the source, the first mirror, the one that started it all." The journal mentioned a hidden chamber beneath the seminary, sealed after the fire, its location known only to the church, its existence a secret buried in consecrated ground. They resolved to return, but the air grew colder, the mist outside thickening, whispering their names in a language that twisted their thoughts, its syllables a siren call to madness. Chapter 14, The Labyrinth Beneath the Earth. The seminary's lowest level was a labyrinth of collapsed tunnels and rusted iron gates, their surfaces pitted with age and decay, their edges sharp enough to draw blood. Clara and Elias navigated by lantern light, the air thick with the stench of rot and something sharper, blood, rust, or both, a scent that clung to their skin like a second shadow. The walls seemed to close in, their shadows shifting as if alive, and the air hummed with a low vibration that set their nerves on edge, a pulse that matched the beating of their hearts. At the end of a narrow passage, they found a sealed door, its surface carved with the crescent moon, its edges sealed with wax that bore the church's sigil, a mark of sanctity that felt like a lie. Elias pried it open with a crowbar, the wood groaning like something in pain, revealing a chamber lined with mirrors, each reflecting a different nightmare, burning children, faceless figures, blood pooling on stone, faces twisted in agony, their screams silent but deafening. At the center was a massive mirror, its surface black as ink, pulsing with a heartbeat that echoed in their chests, a rhythm that threatened to pull them under. Clara's reflection appeared, but it wasn't her. It was Isolde, smiling, her eyes bleeding black, her lips moving in a silent chant that reverberated in their skulls. "You opened the door," she said, her voice echoing, a sound that clawed at their minds, a wound that bled doubt and fear. The mirrors screamed, and the Wraith emerged, tall, veiled in shadow, its face a kaleidoscope of glass shards, each one reflecting a fragment of their fears, its presence a weight that threatened to crush them. Its voice was a million whispers spoken backward, a cacophony that threatened to unravel their sanity. The pact is sealed. Chapter 15, The Price of Blood and Soul. Clara chanted the banishing words from the journal, her voice trembling but resolute, each syllable burning in her throat like fire, a holy fire that fought against the dark. Elias raised the dagger, but the Wraith's claws slashed his arm, drawing blood that sizzled on the floor like acid, the air filling with the stench of burning flesh, a smell that made Clara's stomach churn. "You cannot undo what was promised," the Wraith said, its voice shaking the walls, its form rippling like smoke, its presence a void that pulled at their souls. Clara threw holy water, its droplets hissing as they struck the Wraith, and it recoiled, its form flickering like a broken projection, its scream a sound that threatened to shatter their minds. "We're not your keys," she shouted, her voice rising over the chaos, her words a shield against the darkness. Elias drove the dagger into the altar, cracking it in two, the stone splitting with a sound like thunder, a roar that shook the chamber. The mirrors shattered, their shards raining down like jagged tears, and a wind howled through the chamber, pulling the Wraith back toward the largest mirror, its form twisting and writhing. Isolde's face appeared one last time, her eyes pleading, her voice a whisper that cut through the storm. "You'll pay." The chamber collapsed, stones raining down like judgment, the air thick with dust and the screams of the mirrors, a cacophony that echoed in their skulls. Clara and Elias barely escaped, scrambling through the collapsing tunnels, their lungs burning, their hearts pounding, their bodies bruised and battered. Chapter 16: The town's descent into madness. Veyrune was in chaos, its streets empty save for the mist that curled through them like a living thing, its tendrils whispering secrets no one wanted to hear. The seminary's collapse was blamed on a gas explosion, but the townsfolk knew better, their whispers speaking of curses, ghosts, and a darkness that had awakened in the fog. Shopkeepers boarded their windows, priests burned incense in the streets, and children drew crescent moons in the dirt, their eyes wide with fear, their hands trembling as they worked. The mist grew thicker, its presence a constant threat, its whispers a language that twisted their thoughts. Clara and Elias hid in a safe house, a crumbling cottage on the edge of town, its walls lined with warts scratched into the wood, their edges sharp and desperate. They pored over the journal's final pages, their hands trembling, their eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, their minds frayed by the weight of what they'd seen. "There's one mirror left," Clara said, her voice hoarse, her fingers tracing a cryptic passage, her eyes haunted by the truth. "The source. It's not in the seminary. It's older, hidden somewhere the church could protect, somewhere sacred." Elias's eyes darkened, his voice low, his hands clenched into fists. "The cathedral." Anselm lied. "He's been hiding it all along, protecting a secret that's killing this town." They confronted the priest in the cathedral's nave, his face ashen, his hands trembling as he clutched his rosary, his eyes filled with tears that spoke of guilt and fear. "The first mirror is in the spire," he confessed, his voice breaking, his body shaking as if the truth were a weight he could no longer bear. The church sealed it to contain the wraith, but it was never enough. It's been waiting, all these years, growing stronger in the silence. Chapter 17: The Spire's Forbidden Truth. Clara and Elias climbed the cathedral's spire, the air thin and cold, the wind howling like a chorus of the damned, its wails echoing through the narrow staircase, a sound that clawed at their minds. At the top, they found the mirror, a massive, obsidian slab etched with the crescent moon, its surface rippling like water disturbed by an unseen hand, its edges sharp enough to cut through reality itself. It pulsed with a heartbeat, its rhythm syncing with their own, a siren call that threatened to pull them under, a song of hunger and despair. Clara chanted the banishing words, her voice steady now, the syllables burning in her throat like a holy fire, each word a weapon against the darkness. Elias held the dagger, its runes glowing faintly, ready to strike, its blade a faint hope in the dark. The mirror cracked, and the wraith emerged, its form more solid, its claws dripping black ichor, its face a shifting mosaic of glass and shadow, each shard reflecting a fragment of their fears. "You are mine," it said, reaching for Clara, its voice a chorus of screams that shook the spire, a sound that threatened to unravel their sanity. Elias lunged, driving the dagger into its chest, the blade sinking deep into its unnatural flesh, its runes flaring with a light that burned his eyes. The wraith screamed, a sound that shattered the stained glass windows below, raining colored shards onto the nave, a cascade of broken light. The spire shook, stones crumbling, the air thick with dust and the stench of burning blood, a smell that clung to their skin like a curse. Chapter 18: The Final Stand Against the Void. Clara finished the chant, her voice rising over the chaos, each word a weapon, a shield, a prayer against the darkness. The mirror shattered, and a blinding light erupted, swallowing the wraith, its scream fading into a silence that was somehow worse, a void that pressed against their minds. The spire collapsed, stones raining down like the wrath of a forgotten god, a judgment that shook the earth. Clara and Elias fled, leaping from the crumbling staircase, their bodies bruised and battered as they landed in the square below, the mist swirling around them like a shroud, its whispers a reminder of what they'd faced. The town was silent, the air heavy with the aftermath of something ancient and terrible, the cathedral a pile of rubble, its secrets buried beneath stone and ash. The mist lingered, thinner but ever present, a reminder of the town's unhealed wounds, a presence that watched and waited. Chapter 19, The Aftermath of the Unseen. Weeks later, Veyrune was quiet, the mist thinner but ever present, a reminder of the town's scars. The cathedral was sealed, its mirrors buried in consecrated ground, blessed by priests who whispered prayers they no longer believed, their voices trembling with doubt. Clara sat in her apartment, clutching the locket, its weight a constant reminder of the cost, its cold metal a link to a past she couldn't escape. Elias was gone, lost in the spire's collapse, his final act a sacrifice she could never repay, his absence a wound that refused to heal. She hadn't spoken of the Wraith's final words, whispered only to her as the light consumed it, "I am not bound." Father Anselm visited her, his eyes hollow, his hands trembling, his voice a fragile thread. "You stopped it, child," he said, his words heavy with a hope he didn't feel. Clara shook her head, her voice barely audible, her eyes fixed on the floor, her heart heavy with doubt. "Did I? Or did I just delay it? It's still out there, Father. I can feel it, in the fog, in the shadows, in the silence." Chapter 20, The Eternal Vigil in the Mist. Months passed, and Veyrune tried to forget, its people rebuilding their lives on the ashes of their fear, their hands trembling as they worked. Clara moved to a new town, her notebook filled with stories she'd never publish, their truths too heavy to bear, their weight a burden she carried alone. But every night, she checked her mirror, her reflection steady but not quite hers, its edges blurred by a shadow she couldn't name. Sometimes, it blinked when she didn't. And in the mist outside, a crescent moon glowed faintly, its light pulsing like a heartbeat, waiting for its time to rise again, its presence a promise that the Wraith was not gone, only waiting, its hunger eternal, its debt unpaid.